Let me tell you a little story real quick as we get started here. So I've got 2 hours tonight. I'll do the best I can with this and make it quick. So Steve had it pretty much right. I've been studying and trying to figure things out from an eschatological standpoint for a good while. I had seen a lot of things all throughout my adulthood, really essentially starting at about the time I was 17 years old. Well, about 5 years ago, is it 5 years ago already? Wow. It was brought to my attention that there are these crazy guys on YouTube. And I got to watch this video, my friend said, who has passed away now. But anyway, he said, you got to watch these guys. So I watched them. And it was Steve and Holger. And he was right. They were crazy. And when I watched that, I'm going to tell you right now, it scared me to death. And here's the reason why. Steve and Holger were uncompromisingly preaching the truth. And that's scary. It's scary to people who have come from the background that I do. If I had time, we would go through all of this. But I came from a very conservative Church of Christ background. And to listen to these guys say these things, and I knew it was right. And I had already accepted it by that point. But I knew it was right. And I had to come up here and meet. And so I met with Holger. As a matter of fact, he was coming back from the lectures in Tennessee. And we called him up and said, hey, where's the church building? We're at Taco Bell. And he said, and he gave us directions. And we met and we talked. And I was floored. But I was scared. I was scared. Because when you accept the truth, whatever that truth is, you will face opposition. And in the face of opposition, we must stand. We have to teach what is right. And that's what they were doing. And then it became totally concrete when Steve said, hey, you want to do the show with me on Sunday morning? And so, oh, now, great. There's no backing down now. I'm thinking these guys in Indianapolis are going to hear this show and then they're going to know, and I can't back down anyway. But I didn't care. I didn't want to back down. Steve's right. We're not backing down. We're not backing up. We're not shutting up. Because this is the truth. This is what they were preaching in the first century. And do not take for granted for 1 second that this stuff that we preach about eschatology is about trying to prove that we're right and we want to be better than everybody else and we just want to show people some new truth that we've discovered. That's not it at all. This is about salvation. That's what this is all about.
Amen.
There are a lot of people that are confused about this whole concept today, which is what I'm going to talk about. So, outside of my personal story, let's get into this. And I just want to say how thankful that I am to this congregation for doing this and for the good people that are here. And for those that are watching and will watch these videos over many years, you wouldn't have no idea how effective these videos are. You might think, oh, well, we only got 15 or 20 views. Well, how many people do you need to reach? I mean, we want to reach hundreds or thousands, and we do, because you give this to one person who watches a video and they share it with someone else, or they go into work the next day and say, hey, I heard this crazy guy on YouTube saying Jesus has already returned. And then it's powerful. And we have seen so many people turn to the truth because of these efforts. So we'll just keep it up and we'll keep doing it. Okay, so here's what I want to do this morning. One of the biggest questions that I get asked a lot with this is, well, why if this is the truth, why did nobody see this in the past? Well, they did see it in the past, and I'm going to show you this. But here's the fact of the matter, and I'll just kind of cut to the chase a little bit here. The truth is not easy to digest, so not many people see this. How many times in the Church of Christ have our preachers stood in the pulpit and preached from Matthew chapter 7, the wide gate and the narrow gate? Well, how many people go through that narrow gate? How many people go through the wide gate? So this is nothing new to us. In standing for the truth and earnestly contending for the truth means not a lot of people are going to accept what you have to say. Now run the numbers in your head. How many people in the first century obeyed the truth? Well, it seemed like there was a lot. We can look at the day of Pentecost, and thousands were converted, and a few days later, a few thousand more, and we're thinking, well, we should be able to have those results today. But that was a brand new thing that was taking place. How many of them fell away over the near future years to them before the return of the Lord in 70? A great many. We're going to talk about that apostasy. And that same apostasy is accepted today by people in the Lord's church. And they just accept it wholeheartedly, like, hey, it's okay, it's been taught for 2,000 years. Well, I'm here to tell you, there's a lot of things that have been taught for the last 2,000 years by the early church fathers. Not our fathers. We've got to stop thinking that way. They're not our fathers. They were first century Christians, many of them, some of them not, but many of them were, and they were well-meaning, but they were wrong about a lot of things, and that same lie has been perpetuated on many different levels for the last 2,000 years. So it's our job as Christians to do exactly what Paul told Timothy, to study to show yourself approved unto God. Now, think about this. If we do not look at the Scriptures, whose fault is it that we believe a lie? It's not my fault that you believe a lie. It's not your wife's fault that you believe a lie or an error. It's your fault. And it's my fault. And it's my fault that for 30 years nearly, I rejected the truth when it was right in front of me. But I thought I was doing what was right, just like so many of these men did. So that's essentially what we'll be talking about today for the remainder of our time. So, today's ancient apostasy is the title. Basically, here's what we see. We look at a few passages that I think, I even need that thing right there. There are several other passages that we could examine, but these are the basic four that we're going to look at. I encourage you to open your Bible. I believe in that. I know at a lecture, and these guys, they can just rattle off these passages. My brain does not work that way. I'm wired a little backwards from the rest of y'all here. So we'll actually look in the Bible a time or two, but we want to look at these basic four passages, Matthew 24, 9 through 14, in the Olivet Discourse. This is where Jesus said there's going to be a falling away. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 and verse 3 actually uses the term apostasia, the Greek term, and we're going to show you what that means here in just a moment. And it also predicts this falling away, very specific, and we'll look at that. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 through 3 teach this same falling away, the same apostasia. If I'm saying that right, I don't know. And then again in Luke chapter 18 and verse 8, Jesus said, when the Son of Man returns, will he even find faith? Will there be any faith on earth? Now, that is the biggest statement of all of these things. And that's something that really just made me think. So Christ himself says, when I return, will there even be faith on earth? Now let me share a little story with you. Years ago, there was a man that I grew up with. And he says, you don't have to worry about Jesus coming back. He was a member of the Church of Christ. You don't have to worry about Jesus coming back because as long as there's one faithful Christian on the earth, he'll never come back. Now wait a minute. So now I get older and I'm thinking, where do you find that in the Scriptures? That wasn't at all the case in actuality. But it just illustrates how confused our brethren are about eschatology and about the return of the Lord. Well, they don't know if they should be looking for a 1,000-year reign or a millennial kingdom. They don't know if Jesus is going to come back physically or is it going to be spiritually. And the whole idea of spirituality to most people in the church, whether it's the Church of Christ or the Baptist Church or anything else, is completely and totally lost on them. They view everything so very physical. There's going to be a physical return of Christ. There's going to be a physical resurrection. And some of them believe there's going to be a physical kingdom restored. Okay, so when Jesus said, when the Son of Man comes, will there even be any faith? Anybody but that's faithful? That's huge. And outside of all those things, we're going to look at these a little more in depth. I want to show you the timing about this apostasy, this falling away that was going to take place. And it's right there in those passages. So we're going to look at these. So look at the timing here in Matthew chapter 24. This is from the New King James. Then they will deliver you. Well, who's the you? Remember, we have learned in our studies of eschatology about audience relevance. Remember this? Okay, so who is the you here? It's not me. Who is he talking to? Peter, James, John, and probably Andrew there. And he was talking to them. I'm sure there were others around, obviously. But he's talking to them. And he says, they will deliver you up to tribulation and kill you. And you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Is there any question who he's writing this to? And then, so here's another time statement we've got to look at. He says, and then many will be offended, will betray one another, will hate one another. And then many false prophets will arise and deceive many. Think about this. Look at the time statements. What have we learned? Let's apply all of these things. He says, and then these things are going to take place. You're going to see these things. Many false prophets will arise and deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this is the gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. So who did he say, let's just throw this out there. Who did he say would see the end come? You. So we have to look at this passage and we have to say to ourselves, when is the end going to come and who's going to see it? It's them. It's not us. And the end was for that generation. So all we have to do is look in this and we can see that. But not only that, just go back to verse 3 in Matthew chapter 24. And what does he say? Or what's said there? They ask the questions, when are these things going to take place? And he spends chapter 24 and chapter 25 answering these things. The timing to this apostasy that was going to take place before the coming of the Lord is right here in front of us. At least in this verse. To this falling away, to people losing their faith. However you want to put this. We see that this was time for the first century. What about our next verse? 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. Now this one's very interesting. Verse 3 says, and that's from the New American Standard anyway, no one is to deceive you in any way, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed. So when is the apostasy supposed to take place? And what is the it? Well, this is the exact same thing. Just go back to all of that discourse. What did Jesus teach them? He said, my parousia is going to happen in your lifetime. In verse 34 of Matthew chapter 24, Jesus said, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. How much clearer does it have to get? There is truth, but that truth is so hard to accept because we have been conditioned that it's a lie. And then when we start seeing it, they want to threaten us and they want to say, well, we're going to withdraw our fellowship from you. Tell you what, you go ahead and withdraw your fellowship from me because I'm in fellowship with the Lord on this because that's what He said in the story.
Amen.
2 Thessalonians chapter 2 teaches this apostasy is going to come. Now notice what he says here. He says, do not be quickly shaken from your composure or disturbed either by word or either by spirit or a message or a letter as is from us. So here you've got these guys who are claiming to be apostles. Now, are they speaking the truth? No. Because they said, here it is. This is not exactly the same thing, but it's very similar to what Hymenaeus and Philetus and Alexander were teaching. That these events had passed, but Hymenaeus and Philetus were teaching. But notice this. He says that there are some that try to make themselves out to be apostles. We see the church at Ephesus in Revelation 2 says, you tried them as apostles, found out that they weren't right. Okay? So what's the timing here? The timing is this apostasy is going to take place, but when you see the man of lawlessness revealed, you know that this is it. Okay, now we'll look at this term apostasy in just a moment, but it kind of means revolt. falling away, so forth. And we'll go through that a little more in just a moment. The next one here is, oh wait a minute, no, I want to go back to this. Okay, because in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, all of these things were to take place when? Verse 1, now we request you, brethren, with the regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering together to Him. Did He mince any words here by making them believe that Jesus would tarry for a couple thousand years and then call it soon? No. It was very clear to them. So I'm talking to this guy on Facebook. Oh, Facebook. There are just certain people, this guy maybe not, but there are just certain people you just need to block on Facebook because they're there just to keep you from teaching the truth. Just plain and simple. But anyway, so you got this guy on Facebook and I'm dealing with him. I'm trying to show him some of these concepts. And he says, in these situations, here's his answer. When I give him these passages, he says, I believe everything that verse says. Sure you do. No, you don't. That's a cop-out. That's saying, I've never studied it, I've never learned it, I've never figured it out. Because it plainly and clearly says that Jesus is coming back in their lifetime. They expected it. Paul, under inspiration, wrote it to them. And if he wrote that under inspiration, does anyone else in here have a problem if he was wrong? Am I the only one that would have a real problem with Paul if he wrote to them and told them Jesus was coming back in their lifetime and then he was wrong about it under inspiration? I got a real big problem with that one. Anyway, we could stay here all night. Let's go to 1 Timothy chapter 4. Now this one always intrigued me back when I was a futurist. So I would read this passage here, wrong way, and I would read this. I got electronics. I can read it right here. And here's what it says. The Spirit explicitly says that in latter times some will fall away from the faith, paying attention to deceitful spirits and the teaching of demons, by means of the hypocrisy of liars, seared in their own conscience as with a branding iron, who forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from foods, which God has created to be gratefully shared in by those who believe and know the truth. And there was a point in my life when I thought that he was talking about this is the Catholic Church. Because when I was in 4th grade, we had fish on Friday, every Friday. Right? Had to abstain from meats. The priests weren't allowed. This has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. This has everything to do with what was going on in their lifetime. Not ours. Not in my 4th grade experience. In their lifetime. Now, notice this. He says the Spirit explicitly says. Now, when is this falling away going to happen? When are people going to follow after their own lusts and their own desires and false teachers? When is this going to happen? The Spirit explicitly says, stop right there. The Spirit only spoke up until the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, and then inspiration ceased. Daniel 9 teaches the concept that it was closed, it was fulfilled, it was done at the coming of the Lord and the destruction of the temple and the end of the 70 weeks. So the apostasy, this falling away, could not happen any later than that. There's one time statement. He says that in latter times, they were living in the last days. I love the shirts and the hats that Steve passed out. They were living in the last days. The last days are past. It was their last days. It was the last days of that old Jewish system, that old covenant. Now think about this. Along with the line on the lines of Zechariah 12, 13, and 14. Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 teaches that at the coming of the Lord, at the destruction of Jerusalem, in that day, 20-some times I think it says in that day, in those 3 verses, or chapters. In chapter 13, it is explicitly stated that at the coming of the Lord, when the fountains are open, when the truth goes forth, that the spirits and the teaching is and the false prophet are cast out. They pass out of the land. This falling away could not happen once those demons and those false prophets pass out of the land. It has to happen during that time. Luke chapter 18 and verse 8, Jesus says, I tell you that He will bring about justice for them quickly. Now, when you go back and you look at the story of the woman, and she's constantly begging for relief and that kind of thing, and then the judge finally gives it to her, it's because she was crying out. This is Revelation chapter 6. She was crying out. How long, O Lord, holy and true, will you refrain from avenging blood of your saints that have been beheaded for the cause of Christ? Paraphrasing here. He said, you wait just a little while longer. That was quickly. So Jesus said, when the Son of Man returns, will He even find faith on the earth? So the timing puts the lack of faith in that time frame. Okay, so that's just the opening. I'm just kidding. Let's talk about this idea of the terminology and the... I don't know if you can see that or not very well. But this is what we're talking about. So Strong says that it's a falling away. This is what we read of 2 times in the Scriptures, okay? This is in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. But it's also found in Acts 21 and verse 21. So, it's a falling away or forsaking. And they use the terminology of Paul. The apostles did. They said, Paul, you need to tell these good brethren that you're not teaching them to forsake or apostatize Moses. You see that? That's the same language. So don't forsake them. So that's what this idea of apostasy is. It's falling away or forsaking. Now notice what Thayer says in his lexicon about this. And he says a falling away, defection, or apostasy. In the Bible, namely from the true religion. Now, the interesting thing about this is also, if I would have had time to figure out how to put all this on several slides and all this, I'm terrible at these slide stuff. But suffice it to say, I could have shown you that this is kind of an idea of a revolt. Well, think about this. In 2 Thessalonians 2, he says this apostasy, this falling away, this forsaking the truth comes at the revolt. When was the revolt? During the destruction of Jerusalem. It was who killed all of the Jews in Jerusalem? It was the Jews who were responsible for it. Did the Romans come in? Well, obviously, yes, they did. We know that from history. But ultimately, this was God's judgment on them. And they were revolting not only against Rome. You got to stop thinking about Rome. They were revolting against God. These Jews forsook Messiah. You had all of these signs that said, hey, Messiah is here. Miracles taking place where they had been gone for 400 years. And when they started happening again, and people were being healed, and the dead, literally physical dead people were coming out of their tombs just like Lazarus. And these people looked at Jesus and said, no, you're not the Messiah. That's Matthew chapter 12. That's the unpardonable sin. In my opinion, we can't commit that today. Not like they did. We're not seeing these miracles. These miracles are past. Right? So the miracles are past. Now, if someone came up to me and resurrected someone of my dear loved ones, brought them out of the ground, by the way, let me say this. There's no physical resurrection in the Scriptures past 4 days. You ever thought about that? No physical resurrection in the Scriptures past 4 days. And yet you've got people today teaching, it's been thousands of years, and God's going to come up and He's going to resurrect everybody up out of the ground physically. Well, where do you find that in the Scriptures? The longest they ever stayed in the grave is 4 days. Just a sidebar there. Their problem was they forsook the teachings and the prophecy and the fulfillment of prophecy and rejected Messiah. And they murdered Him. And then they tried to cover it up. See, this is a huge problem for us today. It started 2,000 years ago. The great big cover-up. The cancel culture started 2,000 years ago of Christianity. They wanted to cancel everything that Christians taught and believed and that the Scriptures taught and the fulfillment of prophecy. Why? Because they didn't want you, if you were alive back then, to follow this rabble-rousing Jew. They didn't want you to believe in him. Compromises were made along the way, but it was all because of this falling away. Let's talk about some other things here. Let's look at a few examples. So, we see that Jesus said these things were going to take place. Did they take place? Yeah. So here's what I want you to see. Let's look at Galatians. Remember in Galatians chapter 1, Paul said, I marvel. I love it. Let me preface this. I love it when our detractors say, well, Revelation couldn't have been written in before 70 because these churches were too newly established and it would take a long time, much longer than that, for them to apostatize. Really? So Paul writes to the Galatian brethren, he says, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him who called you by the grace of Jesus Christ for another gospel, which is not another, only some would pervert it. Wait a minute. What was going on before the destruction of the temple in the lifetime of the apostles? It was fulfillment of the prophecy of Matthew 24 and Luke chapter 18 and verse 18 and all the other, and Deuteronomy 32. We really should have spent some time in Deuteronomy 32 because this was prophesied that it would come about at their last days, their latter end. So Paul writes to the Galatian brethren and he says this to them. He says that in chapter 1, which we're familiar with, verses 6 through 9. But notice in verse chapter 2 and in verse 4. I mean, we get so focused and fixated on one verse. We need to see the whole context of these things. So here's what was going on in chapter 2 and in verse 4. He says, but it was because of the false brethren secretly, easy for me to say, right? Secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. What were they actively trying to do in the throes of preaching the gospel in the first century, before the coming of the Lord, before the destruction of Jerusalem? These Jewish brethren, these non-brethren Jews, they were trying to get these Christians to see things. All you got to do, see, we're seeing this today, aren't we? All you got to do is make people afraid and get them to see something just a little bit skewed. And that's exactly what they were doing in the first century. They were brought in secretly. Look at verse 13 and 14 here in the same chapter. He says, the rest of the Jews joined him in hypocrisy, with the result that even Barnabas was carried away by their hypocrisy. What's going on here? Can we not see what was taking place? These guys are trying to change the Christian view. They're trying to cancel the Christian truth. It's being taught. The prophecy that's being fulfilled. But when I saw that they were not straightforward about the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas in the presence of all men, if you, being a Jew, live as the Gentiles and so forth, so we know this idea. But do you get the picture here? And even Peter got carried away with it. So it's not so hard to extrapolate what was going on here. Also in Galatians, look at chapter 6. Here in verse 12 and 13. Here he says, those who desire to make a good showing in the flesh try to compel you to be circumcised, simply so that they will not be persecuted for the cross of Christ. We got a lot of brethren today saying, well, let's just compromise with the cross of Christ. Well, so what? It's not a big deal if Jesus came in 70, as you saying that he's not coming back again. Well, we don't need to know that. We don't need to go around and upset people. Let me ask you something. Any preacher sitting in this room or listening to me worth his salt is not going to compromise on the truth either 2,000 years ago or 2,000 years later.
That's right.
If it is the truth, we must preach it, even if we think there's nobody else around. And the answer comes back to us. There are still thousands, or 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal. We don't know what God is working, but He's working. That, as Tony Beretta used to say, you can take that to the bank. Not many people in here know who Tony Beretta is. I'm telling my age. Anyway, so we see that with Galatians. Now, the rest of my illustration that I wanted to use is going to have to go pretty quick because I want to spend a little time with Hymenaeus and Philetus. But in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, they were false apostles. We've kind of covered that already. In Philippians chapter 3, I think that this one is very interesting because this illustrates so well what's going on today. Philippians chapter 3. Notice here, verse 17, Brethren, join in following my example and observe those who walk according to the pattern you have in us. For many walk, now listen to this, of whom I told you, and now tell you even weeping, that they are enemies of the cross of Christ, whose end is destruction, whose God is their appetite, and whose glory is to their shame, who set their minds on earthly or physical things. Brothers and sisters in Christ, those who reject Jesus as Messiah today through witnessing the miracles and reading the Scriptures according to John chapter 20 are rejecting Jesus as Messiah as much as those people who stood there in that courtyard and shouted, "Crucify Him, crucify Him, we have no king but Caesar." Just as guilty. They are enemies of the cross of Christ. Now, you can say, well, that's just too harsh. I'm sorry, but I'm not apologizing for what Paul said. I'm not going to do it. You thought I was going to say I'm sorry. Let's talk about Hymenaeus and Philetus for just a moment. I looked at Roy and Steve and who else was sitting there? Brent. I said, I need about, 6 or 8 hours for this. I'll just take all of Saturday. How's that? You all can just sit back. No, I'm just kidding. Because they have a lot more important things to say than I do.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay.
I'm kidding.
Hey, I was actually going to try to finish this in 2 minutes. Thanks a lot. Okay. Boy, that was scary. Okay, so let's talk about Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Alexander for just a moment, because they're great examples of people falling away from the truth and teaching error and trying to get other people to fall away from the truth. What you have to understand is it wasn't necessarily the Christians always that were trying or that were falling away from the truth or misunderstanding things. It was others who had evil motives who were trying to get them to fall away from the truth and to misunderstand things and to misdirect them. This is the reason that it was so upsetting to the faith of those in 2 Timothy chapter 2 who heard Hymenaeus and Philetus saying, well, the resurrection's already passed. Now, why would the Christians get so upset over that? They would get so upset over that because Jesus promised them that the signs would accompany the resurrection. You got to keep in mind, there's the big three event. The coming of the Lord, right? The resurrection and judgment day. All occur as a package deal. So they're hearing from Hymenaeus and Philetus that the resurrection has already passed. And then they're saying, well, if that's the case, this is our logic too. So you tell me that these guys weren't pre-preterists in the first century, not Hymenaeus and Philetus. They were erroneous. I'm going to show you that in just a second. But here you have these Christians who are looking for the coming of the Lord and the fulfillment of prophecy. Remember Revelation 19 verse 10? Prophecy proves Jesus is Messiah. That's what Revelation 19:10 essentially says. And if the prophecy doesn't come true, according to Deuteronomy chapter 18, you don't listen to this guy. He's not a prophet. He's not speaking for God. So that's the reason they got all upset when Hymenaeus and Philetus and Alexander came along teaching their erroneous doctrine. That's why they got upset. Because they automatically made the connection in their mind. Then Jesus isn't Messiah. Makes a little more sense now, doesn't it? You got to think like a first century Jew. You got to have the Hebrew mindset. It's called audience relevance. Okay, we get that. At least I get it anymore. Gets me in a lot of trouble. So Hymenaeus and Philetus. Let's go through a few of these things. Because my contention is this, that 1 and 2 Timothy is all about Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Alexander. And if you think that I'm wrong about that, look at how Paul opens up his letter to Timothy. And in the first chapter, he says, listen, among these are Hymenaeus and Alexander, whom I have handed over to Satan, so that they will be taught not to blaspheme. How are they blaspheming? Well, we know now by a systematic study of the two letters that they were denying the resurrection. They were causing people to think that Jesus was a false prophet, that he was one of those false messiahs, that Jesus himself, I'm just kind of extrapolating a little bit here right now, so bear with me, that Jesus himself predicted in Matthew chapter 24 there will be many false Christs. So maybe these guys were saying, well, you know, this Jesus, he didn't get it right, but we got it right. Now, why would they do something like that? First off, sometimes men with evil motives do things that people that are good and honest and have good and honest hearts just shake our heads at. And we're going, why would they do that? Why would they want to kill millions of people worldwide? And we're going, I don't know, it doesn't make any sense to me. It's because you're thinking morally. These people don't think morally. They think selfishly, vain, physical, not spiritual. So, hold on, because we're going to go on a quick ride here. Because I'm running out of time and I got a few things I want to show you. Except that's the wrong note. That's the wrong note. I haven't even referred to any of these notes. I left them all home and I had to take pictures of them. My son sent them to us, and they're actually actual pictures. So they're not real notes. Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Alexander did not keep the faith. 1:19 through 20. As Timothy did. 1:20, they were blasphemers. In the latter times, according to 1:4:1 and 2:3:1, you realize this is 2 Timothy 3:1, right? In the latter times, they would depart and fall away from the faith. And these were men that did this. This is, I think, how this starts. It starts off talking about Hymenaeus and Alexander, and he ends 2 Timothy talking about the same people. Does anybody see an inclusio there? It may not be an inclusio, but I see it. I see something there. Listen to this. They did not continue to hold the testimony of the Lord. 2:1-8, which is also Revelation 19:10. They abandoned the belief of the resurrection. 2:3, verse 14. They were telling people and trying to teach them that judgment had already occurred, if that's what they were talking about. And Paul says to Timothy in 2:4 and verse 1, it's about to take place. It's on the cusp of it. Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Alexander, they were never able to learn the truth. 2:3-7. They were depraved of mind. 2:3-8. They were evil and proceeded from bad to worse. 2:3-13. They were teaching a myth that many brethren adhered to. 2:4-4. Now think about this. I already said they were of depraved mind. Their folly was obvious to all. 2:3-9. Jesus said, I will return in your lifetime. Here's what's going to take place. And they said, no, you're wrong about that. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 8, Paul told Timothy, do not be ashamed of the testimony of the Lord. They were ashamed of the testimony of the Lord. The testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. They were ashamed of that. Now, let me show you something else. In 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 12. I'll actually turn over here. I'm going to I want to show you this. Then we're going to move on. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 12. Notice what Paul says. Turn over here and actually get to this. He says, for this reason I also suffer these things, but I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that he is able to guard what I have entrusted to him against that day. Now look at 2 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 8. Really need to read 6 through 8. But specifically in verse 8, in the future there is laid up for me the crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, will award to me on that day. He starts out talking about that day. He ends talking about that day. I see another inclusive. At the very least, he's saying, hey, look at all of these things. This is all about the false teaching of Hymenaeus, Philetus, and Alexander. Now, you might say, well, what difference does all this make? Well, it does make some difference. And here's the reason why it makes a difference. Because, what about all those people post-70? There are people that lived through the destruction of Jerusalem. There are Christians that lived through the destruction of Jerusalem. There were Jews who were Jews before the destruction of Jerusalem, who lived after the destruction of Jerusalem, were still alive. Now that one had to hurt them, right? Because it forced them to say, and even Josephus admitted this, that God was dealing with them as a people. And anyone who understood the scriptures of these Jews, and they should have understood this, knew that when this temple fell, it would never be rebuilt. Isaiah is pretty clear about that. So they had to come up with something to stay pertinent and to stay relevant. So here's what happened. This post-70 era. I came across this. This is the best slide I've got. Best looking slide I've got. So it took me forever to come up with this. So don't expect any more. So this guy on the internet from Orthodox Christianity, ChristianTheology.com. Here's what he says, and I thought this was pretty pertinent. He says, obviously this false teaching, now this is about when Irenaeus said that Jesus lived to be 50 years old. Scriptures teach differently, but Irenaeus said he was 50, about 50. So this man makes this astute observation. Obviously this false teaching on Irenaeus' part shows that even as early as the 2nd century, traditions can be made up, and staunch defenders of the church are not superintended by the Spirit in which they can avoid botching biblical interpretations. So Irenaeus got it wrong. And then here's what you've got. All these other guys come to his defense and they say, well, it's only one thing. Wait a minute. He says Jesus lived to be 50, about 50. Well, that's okay, just one thing. How many one things is it going to take when you seriously question the authority of this guy? And not to mention, Irenaeus was not inspired. Inspiration ended at 70. But they staunchly defend their lie because they can't admit that they were wrong. That's essentially what's going on today. Let's talk about some of these things. So we've seen in the first century that they were starting to head that way. The apostasy was coming. Right? We've read that from 2 Thessalonians and so forth. Okay? So after 70, here's what you've got. Justin Martyr saw preterism in his day. Listen to what he says. When he was talking to Trypho, I think this is from the dialogue with Trypho. I'm not going to read all this. But notice there in red he says, but tell me to Trypho. Trypho's a Jew. He's trying to convert him. Do you really admit that this place, Jerusalem, shall be rebuilt? Or do you expect your people to be gathered together and made joyful with Christ and the patriarchs and the prophets? So he's saying, you expect the temple's going to be rebuilt? See, these guys were Chiliists. Well, we might, very similar to modern day premillennialism and so forth. So there it is. You think this is going to happen? Now notice what we see there in blue. He says, for if you have fallen in with some who are called Christians. So Trypho's question was, well, what if I fall in with these Christians? How do I deal with it? If you've fallen in with some who are called Christians, but who do not admit this truth, and venture to blaspheme the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, who say there is no resurrection of the dead, and that their souls when they die are taken to heaven. Let me tell you something. Justin Martyr was telling Trypho, he said, listen, If you come across any of these Christians that think that heaven has been opened, don't listen to them. That is preterist teaching. The Scriptures teach over and over and over that heaven has been opened. This is after 70. So somebody after 70 believed that heaven had been opened. Well, our brethren today say, no, no different than the old law. Heaven's still closed. That's sad. Another quote from Justin Martyr. Okay, so this was on observing Old Covenant rites. So Trypho says, well, what if I become a Christian? Can I still keep doing things of the law? How is it, Trypho, that we would not observe those rites which do not harm us? I speak of fleshly circumcision and Sabbath and feasts. Here you've got one of the church fathers, and he's saying it's no big deal if you want to still follow these Jewish beliefs as long as they don't harm us. Really? I can't imagine teaching that. Well, no, you go ahead. So we're trying to convert someone to the gospel, and I actually had a preacher tell me this. I said, so you're going to tell someone that's a Baptist, or I don't remember, he gave me a specific example, and you're going to let that man come in here, and you're going to bring in a band and let him play? You're going to start teaching once saved, always saved, under any condition? Or you're going to do that so you can accommodate him? No, we don't do that. And neither should he. So Trypho asks, why didn't Jesus fulfill all Old Testament prophecy? Listen to Justin Martyr's response to this. Let these things be so as you say, namely that all was foretold, or that it was foretold Christ would suffer and be called a stone, and after his first appearance, in which he had been announced he would suffer, would come in glory and be judge finally of all, an eternal king and priest. Now if this man is to be whom, if this, try this again. Now show if this man be he of whom these prophecies were made. That's what Trypho says. Listen to Justin Martyr's answer. As you wish, Trypho, I shall come to these proofs which you seek in the fitting place. Well, I can't answer it for now. Trypho, this Jew, says, understood it right. And he says, well, I thought all the prophecies were supposed to be fulfilled. And Justin Martyr says, hey, I'll get to it later. As far as I know, he never did. Also, is it okay to observe the law of Moses? And I'm not going to take the time to read this, but essentially he said, yeah, you go right ahead. You go right ahead and observe the law of Moses. Just don't teach other people to do it. This is the reason that we're in such a mess that we are today. Because leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem, you had the Christian cancel culture going on, or the cancel Christian culture going on. Directly after post 70 AD, there were plenty of people who saw it. Trypho saw it and understood it, and he said, well, shouldn't these things have been fulfilled? And Justin Martyr says, no. I'll answer you later. Here's something else I want to show you. This is an excerpt from a presentation that I made about 5 years ago because the members of our congregation were asking me, well, couldn't it be, how could we have missed this? Certainly people saw this. Well, yes, they did. So in the Odes of Solomon is Christian hymns. So these are songs they were singing. They were singing that they had seen His holy day. They were singing, death has been destroyed before my face, and Sheol has been abolished by my word. That is preterist teaching. Now, I'm not saying that they were all preterists in all the things that they taught, but they saw it, they got it. Listen to this one. In 150, in the homily of Pascha, it is I who gave life to the dead, it is I who raised up the buried. Who raised up the buried? What are you talking about? Who will argue with me? It is I, says Christ, who destroyed death. In 150, you had somebody saying, death has been destroyed. Wasn't that what the Scriptures teach? Yes. In the pseudo-Sibylline oracles, for on his appearance the whole creation was shaken and kings perished. Really? That sounds awful familiar, doesn't it? Tertullian. Where do we go with that? But notice what he said. He said that these things, according to Daniel, proves that he had come. I'm not trying to take any of these out of context. But here's one problem we have with the church fathers. It's the same problem that so many people who are trying to interpret things have with the Scriptures. They view it from their paradigm, not the first century paradigm. So they inject a lot of their thoughts onto these guys. Eusebius said, "The Christ of God has come. Since the signs of his coming have been shown in each instance, I have treated to have been clearly fulfilled." Athanasius in 345 said, "It is in fact a sign and notable proof of the coming of the Word that Jerusalem no longer stands." He said Jerusalem is destroyed because Jesus came. The coming of the Word. That's John 1:1. Chrysostom said the second and glorious coming again had taken place, and that they are invisibly present with us here. That's 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. He comes down and dwells with the saved. They're not wanting, in 500, Andreas said, they're not wanting those who apply this passage to the siege and destruction of Jerusalem by Titus. What was it? Revelation chapter 6. They said Revelation 6 was applied to Jerusalem. That's preterist teaching. Now here's an interesting one, since we're really running out of time. And I appreciate the way that you've listened. I'm almost done. But hang on for this, because this is pretty powerful. Pre-preterist. You heard me mention that a little bit earlier as I started the presentation. What's a pre-preterist? Well, it's my term, okay? Because remember I told you, I'm wired a little backwards. Pre-preterist. So what's a pre-preterist? Well, this is someone who is looking forward to the coming of the Lord before it happened. So we look backwards and we say, well, he was talking about these things pre-70 AD or pre-fulfillment. Now, this is very interesting. In AD 62, James, the brother of Jesus, is purported to have said, when they asked him to tell the brethren that Jesus isn't coming back and this isn't going to take place, it's all said and done. Here's what James' answer was. "Why do you ask me concerning Jesus, the Son of Man? He himself sitteth in heaven at the right hand of the great power and is about to come upon the clouds of heaven." In 62, 8 years before the destruction of Jerusalem, James is recorded to have said, Jesus is about to come on the clouds of heaven. If you were a Jew in the first century and you said this man's coming on the clouds, you're saying he's equal to God. That's why they killed him. They shoved him off the pinnacle of the temple and he fell down and he was still alive. And a fuller comes up with his big club and bludgeons James to death. Why? Because he stood for the truth. Now listen to this. These are guys who spoke about preterism before preterism was... Preterism? Enoch. And you're going to say, oh, no, we can't listen to Enoch. I'm not telling you to listen to Enoch. Is Enoch inspired? Listen, here's the way this works. We talked about Justin Martyr, right? So we're listening to him. Enoch has some pretty powerful things to say. Whether it's inspired, whether it's not, I'm not here to debate that tonight. But I want you to see somebody in history, at least 200 or 300 years before Christ was born, said some pretty astounding pre-preterist things. Now listen to this. This is Enoch chapter 1. The words of the blessing of Enoch wherewith he blessed the elect and righteous will be living in the day of tribulation when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. And he took up his parable and he said, Enoch, a righteous man, whose eyes were opened by God, saw the vision of the Holy One in the heavens, which the angels showed me. And from them I heard everything, and from them I understood and I saw, but not for this generation, but for a remote one, which is for to come. Concerning the elect, I didn't mean to do that. I said, and I took up my parable concerning them, the Holy Great One will come forth from his dwelling place. And if you read through this, you see here that either Isaiah copied him or he copied Isaiah. And then Jude comes along and quotes this or something like it. There are plenty of people in the first century that considered Enoch inspired. I'm not saying that we should, and I'm not saying that I do. Wish I had time to explain this, but I don't. But look at verse 9 in chapter 1 of the first book of Enoch. And behold, he cometh with 10,000s of his holy ones. This is what Jude said. to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh of all their works of their ungodliness, which they have ungodly committed, and all of the hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. Now remember, he opened it up by saying that he's coming in judgment in a remote generation. Now here's the interesting thing. In chapter 10, he goes on to say this. Talking about the angels, the Genesis 6 account. Bind them fast for 70 generations in the valleys of the earth, till the day of their judgment and their consummation, till the judgment that is forever and ever is consummated. In those days, they shall be led off to the abyss of fire and to the torment and to the prison in which they shall be confined forever and ever. Now, the demons in Matthew 8 asked Jesus, have you come to torment us before the time? So the ancient peoples understood that this time was coming. That these demons would be, Revelation 20, cast into the lake of fire. Right? Now, whether Enoch is inspired or not, Enoch said these things are coming. And he said they're coming in 70 generations. And he said this is the judgment that is going to take place. And in Luke chapter 3, verse 23 to 38, read the genealogy. 70 generations from Enoch. Luke records 70 generations from Enoch to Jesus. Wow. So either Enoch got it right, or he was inspired, or he wasn't. See, let me explain this real quick. Let me take just 1 minute to explain this. Okay, so Enoch lived before the flood. They didn't believe in writing. They didn't write. They trusted words more than they trusted writing. So the writing of Enoch, or the prophecies of Enoch would not have been recorded until much later. And we see this in 200 or 300 before Christ. So they started writing these things down. We don't have any extant writings of Enoch. But Enoch said in 70 generations the Lord will return. And this will take place. And judgment will occur. The demons will be cast into the lake of fire. I believe Luke. Luke was right. He was inspired. 70 generations. Okay. Now that my introduction's over, let's see what else we can do here. I really just want to leave you with this impression that as preterists, that's Christians, right? When you hear that term, hear in your mind, Christians. As children of God, as Christians, we need to understand we're not alone today, and we're not alone throughout history. We can see the progression of how this took place and how they fell away and why they did it. I didn't even cover all of my pictures yet. And it's not so far out of the realm of possibility to extrapolate why and how it took place. But do not mistake for 1 second that this is all about salvation. All about salvation. And if you were to go through Isaiah 25, you would see that this is when the Lord comes. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Isaiah 25. And it's at the time of the wedding feast. It's at the time when Sheol was destroyed. It's at the time of salvation. And we've got the most powerful tool in our arsenal, the fulfillment of prophecy. Nobody else in the world has that other than the Christian who is teaching and preaching eschatology as they believed it in the first century. And if we're not using that to convert people to Christ so that they can have salvation, then we're leaving out something that Peter, Paul, James, Andrew, John, all of them used. That's the gospel. Thank you.
Amen.